Hello, it's good. Good morning, church. Welcome. My name is Adam Boji, and I serve along. You like that? Is that better? All right. Good morning. Again, my name is Adam Boji, and I have the privilege of serving alongside the amazing security team that we have out front. Today, we're going to be reading through the book of Genesis, starting in chapter 16 and verse 3. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai his wife took the Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think is best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said to her, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I am running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." Then the angel added, "I will also increase your descendants, that they will be too numerous to count." Then the angel of the Lord also told her, "You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery, and he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave his name to the Lord, who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me," for she said, "For now I have seen one who sees me." That is why the well was called Bir Lahairoi. It was still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave him the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. The word of the Lord.
Wow, how many of you remember that interview? That was heavy. And as we move into Genesis now, brand new season of the Genesis series Behind the Curtain, we're looking at a royal family. Remember, Abram and Sarai become Abraham and Sarah. And God sees them as royalty, and other nations see them as royalty as well. And it's a royal family that is in complete chaos. You have three people in a marriage here in this passage alone, and you see the classic marks of dysfunction. I think behind the scenes, as we look at them, again, we want to take cues for our own lives in our own relationships. It's easy to look at the scripture and just say, well, faith will be counted as righteousness, and look at all the theological things that are happening in this passage. But behind the scenes, these are real people. I've always said that you could be in the Bible. Any of us could be in the Bible. They were just normal people just like us that God used for extraordinary things. And as you look at Abram and Sarai, they have a relationship and they have a family that is completely torn apart in so many ways. And so behind the scenes, this week, I want to look at the family element of it, the familial aspect of it, behind the theological aspect. We're going to get to the theology. We're going to get to the great faith where he sacrifices or is willing to sacrifice his son and all the stories you know. But there is a lot going behind the scenes here, and we want to be a practical church. We want to be a church that helps you live your life in a better way and make better decisions. As I started studying the dysfunctional family that you're going to see here, you're going to see some telltale signs. I came across a list of 9 hallmarks of the dysfunctional family. This is what it was. Number 1, members often deny responsibility for their hurtful behavior. We actually see that happening. We see that with Sarai, where she starts blaming Abraham for a decision that she made. Members use intimidation to maintain power in the family. Certain family members' needs are expendable. Maybe you've seen that, where just certain family members, they don't get heard. Reality is difficult to discern. Number 5, victims are made responsible for their abusive behavior. See that in this passage. Family appearance is deceptive. We got this perfect family going on. I remember my mom, she took it down. We had this picture of our family in the 70s, and everything looked amazing. And my mom one day said, that's the way we were. And I said, well, I'm just glad we're not that way anymore. But everything looked perfect on the outside. There was, all the other things that were going on behind the scenes. There was no straightforward and healthy communication. Healthy emotions are not valued. They exhibit poor boundaries. Well, I think taking your maidservant and asking your husband to sleep with her is probably a sign of some poor boundaries that are going on there. Just saying, just up to me. So pretty dramatic things, but it's little things that can actually oftentimes lead to this. And what I wanted to say, if you look in your notes, I wanted to really show that God is also a character in the family. God created the nuclear family as the government that will run the earth. There are governments that work with families, but we never want to let the power of the individual family, the locus of control, the local government of the family be broken down and to be superseded by a governmental system. God intends for godly families, godly individuals, building godly families to be where everything else comes from. As a church, that's what we are excited about, and one of the things that Christianity is excited about. And what I put here is in the notes is this. Few things hinder the work of God like a family steeped in chaos, dysfunction, and emotional turmoil. Genesis 16 tells the story of a broken family that God won't give up on. That's the key. God tells this story, Genesis 16, of a dysfunctional, chaotic, broken family, and it's pretty easy to have been a part of one of those, or to have that happen in our own lives, or to have come out of it, to see all this chaos and to be overwhelmed, as we saw in Nehemiah, by the rubble. That Nehemiah is overwhelmed sometimes by the rubble, but God takes the rubble, the broken stones, as you remember from a couple series ago, and he rebuilds the walls with that broken rubble. I come from a family myself that had some of the major hallmarks of this dysfunction, but over a series of years and decades, God has shaped that and changed it. My wife said at the dinner table, we have a family night, a regular family night once a week. And my wife was sitting around the table the other night, and she said, you know what, I love our family. And I can remember, loving things we did as a family and certain things, and loving all the individual members of a family. But I'm not sure if you would have asked me when I was 12 that any of us would have said we loved our family in that way. And so what we want to put on display for you today is that God wants to be a part of your story. And God is redemptive and redeeming in the story. Let's look at the characters here. It's a bunch of characters, God being the main one that we're going to see. First, you have Sarai. Remember, her name has not been changed to Sarah yet. Sarai, she's, at this point in her story, the manipulative and controlling victim. She's manipulative, she's controlling, and she's the victim. What a fun parlay. You get to be all three of those, right? You're like, I know somebody like that. Abram, the dishonest, he was dishonest, we'll see, and disengaged father. Dishonest and disengaged. Read a statistic today that the number one reason why women have affairs is that their partner no longer pays attention to them. Number one reason men have affairs, this is what it said in the thing, because she was hot. Seriously, isn't that stupid? That showed the difference between men and women. It actually said that, because I'm doing a podcast tomorrow called What Love Got to Do With It, with about 5 of our 20-somethings out of Joe's group, and we're going to be interviewing and talking about some of these statistics, dating and Tinder and all these other things. We're going to be talking about it. But he was disengaged. You want to lose your marriage, men? Disengage. Disengage from listening, disengage from seeing, disengage from caring. You want to lose. I'm not saying your wife's going to have an affair, but that was the number one reason, and I saw that as I was doing these things. He was the dishonest and disengaged father. Now, all that changes for him. See, here's the good thing. You can change your story. You can change your story at any point. You can jump and get on a different track in the moment. Jesus redeems in the moment, and you can change your story. We see Hagar. Hagar, actually, maybe you didn't know this, not only the maidservant, she actually, if you read in that scripture, becomes a second wife. I had never seen that before. I thought she was always just the maidservant that was given so that Sarah could have this child through her maidservant. And I don't really know how the legality of that worked, but for some reason, Sarah was supposed to get the benefits of having a son through the maidservant. She actually, it says in the passage, gave her to be the wife. Wow, what a great situation that is. I would say, women, bad call, okay? You don't want to do that. And so we see that Hagar is ambitious. She's ambitious. And yet mistreated maidservant. Let's look at Sarai. Let's look at these characters. Maybe, now, what I don't want is this. You go home today and like, hey, he was talking to you. You know, and I, look at yourself. We all have a part to play in the dance. We all have a part to play. This is to look at ourselves and for each of us to make some big changes and difference. So the first is Sarai. We see Sarai in this passage. Sarai means contentious and quarrelsome. Contentious and quarrelsome. And so there seems to be this contention. Now God changes her name. We know that God wants to change our names as well, and he often has a name that will reflect the actions of the person. Let's look at her a little bit. First of all, we know that she was barren. In Genesis 11:30, 5 chapters before this, it says, now Sarah was barren, and she had no child. Now, one of the things you're going to know about antiquity is that antiquity is not like today. Antiquity didn't have the luxury of marrying someone due to attraction. If attraction happened, it was a bonus. Antiquity was not about attraction, it was about survival. And you are going to see people trying to survive here. They're doing anything that they can to survive. And one of the reasons that women in this culture found their value in being able to produce children, and especially male children, was for protection and work in the field. Because you would want to have as many children as possible because it could build your clan, it could build the size of your family, and it actually brings protection to the family. It wasn't about attraction. Everything these days is about attraction. As long as you're attracted, everything's cool. There was a utilitarian understanding here, and she was barren. And so this really tied into the self-worth of women of this time. Of this time, if you could not provide that, it wasn't about the latest look that Kim Kardashian was putting out there, if you could pull that off or whatever it would be. It was about, can you provide sustenance, stability, and can you provide male heirs for that very reason? And so you have to realize there was a woman here who felt that she had no value. She looked and she felt that she had no value. I think one of the best things that husbands can do in relationships is continue to value your wives and let them know they are of value with your actions. And so for one reason or another, she was finding her value in that, and it was causing her as to be manipulative and controlling. You'll see that in a moment. Sometimes we live in survival mode. Often we get pushed against the walls, and then we start making bad decisions. Survival mode causes bad decisions. And if we don't look at our issues in the face and make changes, we stay in that survival mode. If you've been in survival mode for 3 to 5 years, 6 years, I would say sometimes it's probably decisions we're making on our own. Not always. Sometimes there's sickness and things like that, but obviously we see that. Also, we see that she was actually trafficked by her husband. That's a modern word, but once again, Abraham was in survival mode. In Genesis 12:13, he goes to Egypt because of a famine. And during the famine, he says, hey, we're going to go in there. And she must have been a looker because he said, they're going to see you. They're going to think you're amazing looking, and they're going to basically kill me and take you. So if you go in and see me as your wife, because there was an honorable thing where they would say, hey, they'll barter with you. You know what I mean? Like, hey, your sister, would you marry your sister to me? And we'll work this out. Because everything was based on survival, right? It wasn't based on the luxuries we have in a Western society with margin. It was based on this. And in Genesis, it says, 12:13, say you are my sister. Now, he's already married to her at this point. That it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. See, at this point, there wasn't the faith of Abraham, willing to die for God, willing to trust his whole life with him. He was terrified. He's going into a new place. They have nothing to eat. They're moving in, and he says, just tell him you're my sister. And they take him up on that bargain. Now, as I said to the ladies, bad decision with Hagar. Dudes, bad decision, okay? As we see that. So we see that she was trafficked. Imagine feeling that way. Imagine the feeling that she would have. Now, maybe in that society, she would have understood it as like, okay, this is just how things go. I don't know. I don't understand a mind from 3,500 years ago, but it would have to speak to your value to say that, he wasn't worth, dying, he wasn't worth, he would rather trade me than die for me. Any woman who feels that way is not going to feel valued in the marriage. And so there is that in that. We see that she's trafficked. Incredibly complex characteristics. Let's go to verse 3. She was controlling. So we say that she was barren, she was trafficked, she was controlling. No wonder. Look at the life she was living at the moment. It says, so after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant and gave her to her husband to be his wife. She was trying to control the circumstances. Abraham, she really did not need to provide for Abraham at this point. Why? Because he had been to Egypt, and when he ended up leaving Egypt, because remember, Pharaoh came to him and he said, hey, there's all these plagues over my family. That's not your sister. That's your wife, dude. And now I'm getting all these plagues against me. You got to go. And he says, you are obviously God is on your side. I don't want to mess with God. And then he says, I'm going to give you all of this treasure. I'm going to give you servants. So basically, when Abraham left, because God's hand was on Abraham, even after he had made a mistake, God redeemed it. When Abraham left Egypt that first time, he left with a bounty. Sarah didn't actually need to produce for him anymore, but she was still locked into that mindset of having to, and she became controlling. Now, here's one thing that's interesting. Hagar, as we'll see in a moment, it is believed, I went to the Jewish encyclopedia, Hagar was the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, I had never known that. It is believed, I read in the Muslim history, but if you go to Jewish encyclopedia or you just Google, not at the moment, Hagar, daughter, my wife, as soon as I do that, she'll just be Googling and then she's gone for 15 minutes of the sermon down the rabbit hole. That Hagar was actually a daughter of Pharaoh, and he gave his daughter because they saw Abram as royalty. Once again, like we saw at the beginning with Dai, this is a royal family in turmoil, and then now they have the daughter of Pharaoh. Really interesting that remember when Moses, later on in the story, goes into the reeds, who picks him up? The daughter of Pharaoh picks him back up, and then he becomes a son of the household. It goes full circle where he becomes an adopted son of the Pharaoh. Moses does, if you remember that story. Really unique, interesting biblical history there. But she was controlling, and then she also played the victim. Then Sarai said to Abraham, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. That's pretty funny, right? Like she made up he has nothing to do with it other than listening to her voice. And it did say that earlier on, that he listened to her voice. I want to encourage you, the number one voice we need to listen to is God, not our spouse. We need to listen to the voice of our spouse, but it needs to be weighed against God. And when it says that Abram listened to his wife's voice, the meaning of the word listen there means to as if instead of listening to the voice of God. She said, I put my servant in your arms, and now she knows she is pregnant and despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. That was actually a stupid comment, because if the Lord had to judge between him and her, the Lord was taking Abraham's side. We're pretty sure of that, but she was desperate. Let's look at Abraham. Abraham, called Abram at the time. Let's go to verse 4. I'm going to show that he's weak. Abraham is weak. In verse 4, it says, he slept with Hagar. She conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Give that a moment ago, that he just folded to whatever his spouse wanted. That goes either way, right? That can go either way. You don't want to disappoint somebody. Finding that balance between, finding unity and also following God is difficult in a marriage. But we see that he was weak. He wasn't the strong man that he would become, and we know that he actually becomes an incredibly strong man who God, bases the entire faith upon. And then finally in verse 6, not only was he weak, he was disengaged. Verse 6, your servant is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think is best. Leave me out of it. That is not the way to be a man in a relationship. The way to be a man in a relationship is to have a dialogue, to hear your wife, to see your wife, and to actually figure out what God is trying to do, as she does as well, and be able to give and counsel from the perspective of God. He was not doing that. The role of a man, one of the roles of a man is to lead in a family, and one of the roles of a woman is to lead in a family. And we lead and we choose in different ways because we both need to lead, right? But he was usurping his responsibility to let her know what God would say. He was somebody who would eventually speak the oracles of God, but he couldn't even speak to his wife. You see, sometimes we usurp our responsibility. We abscond our responsibility because it's easy, because we don't want to deal with it, because we don't want to stand up to make a difference. Abram means high father. Abram means high father. Remember, Sarai, as we looked at it, meant contentious and quarrelsome. We'll see in a moment these names are going to be changed. Why? Because there's somebody else in the story, right? God. Let's not forget. Let's just remember him real quick in the story. There's somebody else in this story, God, who is having something to say about it. Hagar. What does Hagar mean? It means forsaken. Hagar means forsaken. According to Muslim and Jewish belief, she was the daughter of the king of Egypt who was gifted to Abram's wife, Sarah, or Sarai. She was also arrogant. Showed some arrogance there in verse 4. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. If you read the Jewish encyclopedia, you're going to see it says the story, and I don't know where they get all this backstory, that Sarai had to convince her to do this, that even Hagar thought this was a bad decision. And as it was telling that story, Sarai was doing anything in her power to control the situation. That's opposite of the story of faith. Remember, if you look at the heroes of the faith in Hebrews, that is, we see Abraham, after his name has been changed, being one of the fathers of the faith, but it wasn't there yet. So where we are is not always where we're going to end up being. And so the final thing we see is that she was forsaken. If you want to go to verse 7, the angel of the Lord found Hagar, circle found Hagar, near a spring in the desert. Love that. Love that. Would have been easy for God to say, hey, she's an Egyptian maid. We know what's going to happen with Pharaoh. We know what's going to happen with Joseph and Moses. And she's just this Egyptian maidservant. She doesn't really factor into the line of what's happening, into the story. Let's just disregard her. But he doesn't disregard her. One of the reasons he doesn't is because he made a promise to Abram. And the promise to Abram was that I will turn your descendants into a great nation. I will turn your descendants into a great nation. And so we begin to see this redemptive arc happening in her life, and you see that. One of the things that's really interesting, as you look at Hagar, because God had promised he would turn him into a great nation, God does do that, and he has to honor his promise. One of the reasons that's why Hagar is considered by the Muslim people, she is in the line of Muhammad. She goes back to Muhammad, and then also the Arabic people are believed to come from Hagar. Do you know all that stuff that happens in the Middle East? This is why. This decision, this splitting where God says, I will make you the greatest, a secondary, basically, he says, I'm paraphrasing, you will be a secondary nation. You will be, your son will be you will be the mother of a great nation, of a great people. Well, Abram, he says, your son will be of many nations. And so he's able to honor both in that. But you see this conflict that is happening because of this decision that they made, this conflict that was happening that we see with Abram and Hagar. And so as we continue on, I want to say this, that God sees you as you look in this box again. Actually, forgive me. Go to verse 7 again. My bad. I'm going to get to that. The angel of the Lord found Hagar. And that's one thing I wanted to make sure I said today. And that's why I'm going back. I want to say no matter where you are, God sees you there. And he can find you there. And where you are and his presence is, there is a spring that can bring refreshment to that place. No matter where you are. I've seen the worst family stories redeemed. After 30 years of doing this, there is not a family story. There is not a kink in the story that I have probably not seen at this point, and I've seen so many of them redeemed. God can redeem your story. And I love that what she says at the end, because this is really the redemptive arc. And if you are not on the redemptive arc, maybe now is the time to start that redemptive arc. In verse 11, the angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now with child, you will have a son. His name shall be Ishmael. For the Lord heard of your misery. Say, the Lord, if you have misery, cry out to the Lord. God hears your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. Go on to verse 13. She gave him the name the Lord, spoke to her, and she said, you are the God who sees me. I have now seen the one who sees me. I just felt like I was supposed to reaffirm to you that if you might feel out in the wilderness, you might feel like you're in the desert, nowhere to go. God sees you, and he wants to redeem your story arc. We have a story arc, and he can redeem it. We can step into that redemption, or we continue to step into the dysfunction. It is often up to us. God sees you. He remembers you. He is for you. God is the redeemer of broken stories and broken families. Guaranteed, this is what God wanted me to say to you today. Guaranteed. Prayed this week. I said, God, what do you want me to say? There's a lot of places I could go here. I could do the theology. I could get to Jesus. I could get to all the different parts of faith. Or I could talk about families. And God said to say this, and I spent time writing this. I didn't just, first thing that came to my head. I felt like the Lord wanted me to say to you, God sees you. He remembers you. He is for you. God is the redeemer of broken stories and broken families. Sarai, as we come in for our landing, Sarai has a story that is healed. Genesis 17, a chapter later, says 15 through 17, and God said to Abram, as for Sarai, your wife, you will not call her Sarai. Remember what that meant, right? It meant contentious, but Sarah will be her name. That means princess. Woo! It's a big story arc change. Contentious, you go look up in the Proverbs, contentious woman, and see what comes up. Just do it. 4 or 5 of them in there. Talk about that contentious woman. Give you a couple hints. Better to live on the corner of a roof than with a contentious woman. That's just one of them. You can look up the rest. It says a bunch of stuff about men too, so don't you all worry, okay? I will bless her, this princess, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Ooh, let me do that again. That's fun to do. Look at where she was. Look at the brokenness. Barren, trafficked, like set aside, no self-worth, just there in that place. And out of that was coming all this dysfunction and hate and anger, and everything that she was doing was coming out of that place. But God says, I have a promise. I have a promise for her. And God has a promise for you when we step into it. She's no longer Sarai. She's Sarah. Let's go to verse, you'll see in the notes there, Genesis 22, 17 through 18. Abram is no longer Abram. Abram means high father, right? He wasn't being a high father. He's being a father who was disengaged. It says, I'll surely bless you, and I'll surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gates of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Wow. Wow. Weak and disengaged. Weak and disengaged to that. Men, if you are disengaged, get your act together. Re-engage. Re-engage with God, your Father. Re-engage with your children. Re-engage with your wife. Disengage from things that will move the compass of your heart in a different direction. Man up. Man up and have character. We have got to be men that make a difference. Fathers matter. We live in a society where we're a fatherless generation and a fatherless society. Fix your marriage. Work on your stuff. Look your children in the eye. Look your wife in the eye, or whatever it is, or whatever is happening. Make a difference. We'll talk to the women tomorrow night on the podcast. We'll see what they have to say about things like this, and we'll put that out before Valentine's Day. We'll let them speak out for themselves, right? Got some good questions. Final one, Hagar. Look at this story arc. The angel, verse 9, the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. That's a tough word. Didn't change her name. Interesting. The angel added, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. Number one, religion in the world, the largest people group in the world is Christians. In the world, still. God said, I'm going to do that to Abraham. That's true. You know what number two is? Muslims. Right. Maybe the story's right. Maybe it's coincidence. I don't know. It says then, I will so increase your descendants, they will be too numerous to count. In verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. Here's two things, and this is your homework. Give you a prescription. We're done. One, men, women, identify and address the dysfunction in your lives. Identify it, address it. Stand up to it. Don't be too afraid. Stand up to the addiction. Stand up to the whatever it is. I gave you a 9 at the beginning. There's a lot more than that. There was a list of 50. I was like, I don't want to overwhelm. Number 2, live in the redemptive arc. Live in the redemptive arc. It can go like this. It might take 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 10, 20 years, but you start getting that momentum. Mom got sober in 1979. We're well into the redemptive arc. Well into the redemptive arc. Before that, there was all kinds of craziness. It takes years. It might be generations. But your grandchildren, your children's children, that's what matters. Be the one. Be the one. It takes courage to be the one, to stand up and say, no more. I watched last night, my daughter and I watching Lord of the Rings. Okay? When Gandalf, he's there in the Balrog, okay, is there trying to come across this demon. What does he say to him? You shall not pass. And at a certain point, you got to look at the stuff in your life like Abraham did. We're going to get to it. It's good. You draw a line in the sand, and it might be you trying to get across this you of the flesh, and you say, you shall not pass by the Spirit of God. Amen? Stand.